Act 1 of Ruth ends with Naomi returning with Ruth to her native land and to her people in Bethlehem. And she declares at the end of chapter 1, verses 20 and 21, that the Lord, the Almighty, don't call me Naomi, pleasant, call me Marah, bitter, for the Almighty has made me bitter. Very strong language. He's dealt very bitterly with me, verse 20. I went away full, verse 21. The Lord, Yahweh, has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord, Yahweh, has testified against me? The Almighty, Shaddai, has brought calamity on me. So we said this, that we need to have room in our theology for struggling with bitterness toward God. Because God doesn't rebuke Naomi, He starts to work in her life. And we might look at her and think, well, these are very hostile words against God, blaming God for losing her husband, losing her sons, for the famine that sent them out of the land. Do you think that she's being unfair with God, or how would you feel in that situation? How do we look at Naomi here? Is it okay to have times where you blame God for suffering you're experiencing in your life, or you wonder, you struggle? At least we struggle with it, right? The Psalms of Lament, as we pointed out over and over, which are a great portion of the Psalms, show in their complaints against God. They're inspired by God and their prayers to God, and so they show you there needs to be room and for our understanding of our relationship with God, that God is so gracious. He bears with us even when we question Him, even when we struggle with what He's doing in our lives. And the Psalms of Lament help you put that in perspective, because they show how to deal with that by reassuring yourself and reminding yourself and coming back to a posture of faith. But Naomi's very bitter here, and so far the one we're impressed with is Ruth. Well, the chapter 1 ends then, verse 22, really some would look at that as the beginning of the next act, but I think it really closes off Act 1. Yeah?
Yeah, I think you're right about the fact that sometimes we are. I think about Job. Job
right.
was pretty bitter toward God, and God bore with him, but He also slapped him upside the head a couple of times. And
right.
said, hey, you need to wake up to what's actually going on. And I think as we mature spiritually, we begin to see that God hasn't done something to us maliciously, that if it's something that God did, it may not be, then He's got a plan in mind that's going to end up for our benefit, and we need to just stick with it. For our ultimate good, right. Not our momentary comfort, right, but our ultimate good, God can be working, and for His ultimate glory, right? And I like the comparison with Job, because what's similar to Job and Naomi, among the other things, including what you pointed out, is God doesn't explain Himself to Job. God doesn't come and tell him, well, Job, see, I was allowing the devil to test you because I was showing what great faith you have. And that He never tells him what happened to set up his whole situation of profound loss and misery. And God never does directly come and address Naomi and say, well, Naomi, I'm about to do something great here in your life, so bear patiently with me. There are times where God steps in and speaks. Is anyone too warm in here? I see Jackie fanning herself. Do you have the vapors? Jackie, I believe you have the vapors. I'm just thinking of your accent and you're fanning yourself. All right, so they return. Verse 22, Naomi returned and Ruth the Moabite. Notice she's called Ruth the Moabite. I just wanted to go back and catch that, because the narrator is going to immediately call her that again. Well, we don't need her identified for us again a moment later as the Moabite, but he's keeping before us that she is this foreigner, because that, as we pointed out already, highlights something. It makes God's treatment of her and her treatment of Naomi and the treatment of the people toward her extraordinary. So we're reminded of that over and over. We'll see in a moment. Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So it's around April and May.
And she ends up gleaning through the barley and through the wheat harvest, which were around the same time of year where those crops would be brought in from the field. So they arrive, and because Naomi heard that the Lord had visited his people with bread. So Act 2, boy meets girl. That's what you could call this here. Act 2. And remember we said God doesn't come to Naomi and explain to her what's happening, and he doesn't send a prophet or someone to rebuke her, but he sends her barley, Boaz, and a baby. I like that. So here's Act 2. Boy meets girl. So I have the text here. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's. A relative of her husband's. A relative of ours. And it's interesting, he's going to be called this Redeemer, this Goel elsewhere. But right now, he's being introduced proleptically. That is, he's being identified as such before we know that about him. Sort of like when you say, Abraham Lincoln was born, when you say President Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Illinois, well, he wasn't President Lincoln when he was born in the log cabin, but you understand you're identifying. And what's happening here is he's introducing Boaz before we encounter him, and this is creating interest. This is sort of heightening the interest as, well, who Naomi is suffering, and she's in this hardship, and she's bitter, and Ruth has come back with her. Is God going to do anything? Is this man Boaz now, this character we're introduced to, is he going to be a figure that's going to be involved in what God is going to do? So it creates interest, it arouses your interest and creates suspense. So that my point is, as we said in the introduction to Ruth, the narrative is written with great brevity. It's concise, and it's written in a brilliant fashion if you pay attention to these kind of details. So he had a relative of her husband's, and he was a worthy man. You see that term here. A worthy, Ruth is going to be called that same thing later in chapter 3, verse 11. She's going to be called a worthy woman. And the word, actually, it's interesting, worthy man, it's in Judges 11:1. Jephthah, this same expression is used of Jephthah, and there it's translated, he was a mighty man of valor. So it can mean someone who is courageous or virtuous, and it has a broad range of meaning, and it seems to be suggesting he's a man of moral character, and he's a man, but it's more than that. He's a man of standing, and some even have said, one commentator said, think of it like a knight in perhaps in medieval European categories. He's someone who is of standing. He's a person of standing and substance. And he's a person who's respected in the community. So he's a worthy man. And later he's going to say that about that same thing about Ruth. Yeah.
Mine says a man of great wealth.
Yeah, it's interesting that some translations, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I don't think that's the best rendering of it, actually, which is why the ESV and newer translations don't limit it to just the idea that he was a wealthy man. Because as we said, it can be used of valor or courage. It's used that way of Jephthah in Judges 11:1. And from looking at it in the context where it appears, it's not just that he was wealthy, but that's why it would include that, it seems. So that's why we said he's a man of substance, but not just that. That's why I like that it's rendered this way, because it's going to be used of Ruth in chapter 3, verse 11 as well. Well, she's not wealthy. Ruth's not wealthy. So it can include that, but doesn't necessarily mean just that. And you think of, like in Proverbs, chapter 30, is it verse 11? The worthy woman, a virtuous woman, an excellent woman, a noble woman. That's how that word is translated. A noble woman, a worthy woman, who can find? And that's the term. So it's a rich word. Anna.
Well, we consider the word wealth associated with money, but it definitely is not. I know the King James says a man of wealth, but you can be wealthy and poor as Job's turkey, you know?
Yeah, I don't think that's the sense, though, in which the King James is trying to convey it. But he is a man rich. He's rich in character. He's rich in other aspects, not just the money. It's Proverbs 31:10 that says the worthy woman, if you were checking that. But obviously the point is this is a man that stands out in this community, and we're going to see why, of course. So notice that Ruth the Moabite, verse 2, and Ruth the Moabite. So we were just told she's the Moabite, but the writer keeps reminding us that she's the Moabite. In fact, here I've got the verses. See, when I do this, by the way, and when I put the boards up there, if I slide something in like this that's not on the board, it won't be on the boards that have been uploaded because it only uploads the page that is in view. So that's why I'll try to go back later. But this is where in the book he keeps calling her Ruth the Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite. So it's an emphasis that we're supposed to keep her nationality and her origin in mind. I'll leave that there just a second. And so notice the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." This is great. They've got to have something to eat. So they've just come to this community, and unless they go out and beg or people come to them and give them something to eat, they are not going to have, all they're going to have is whatever provisions they traveled with. And Ruth needs to go out and work that day so they have something to eat that day. This chapter gives us a great insight into the plight of the poor in ancient Israel. And that brings to mind what the law says. Notice she said to go out and glean among the ears of grain. Now this would be actually alluding to a provision in the law for the poor in these texts in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, where when you were gleaning the fields, there are a number of provisions in the law for the care of the poor that often expressed in the concern in this triad we said right here for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. Over and over in Deuteronomy you find those three linked together. Sometimes, like I think in the Exodus text I have there, it's just the fatherless and the widow, the orphan and the widow. But the sojourner, that's what Ruth is. So you had this provision. And notice the concern in the New Testament as well. James 1:27, pure religion. What is real, true religion? Well, James summarizes it this way. True religion and undefiled in the sight of God is to visit or care for the orphans and the widows in their affliction. So in other words, to summarize being benevolent toward others, even in New Testament times, those were the most vulnerable and needy in society. So that's the way James wants to say, this is how you show your religion is true and that it's real when you take care of people in need. Well, who are the people in need? Well, typically it was the orphans and the widows. They didn't have the kind of social safety net that we sort of take for granted, where you have social institutions and benevolent organizations and resources that people can draw upon and what have you. In 1 Timothy 5, there's a long section where Paul tells Timothy how to instruct the church to take care of true widows who don't have family that can support them. All right, so you have this provision. In the gleaning of the fields, they were to leave the corners ungleaned for travelers, for those who would pass by and need something to eat. You couldn't just stop at Buc-ee's back then. That was the Buc-ee's, right? That where you just got something that was left in the corners of the fields along the roadside. But also when they were gleaning, they were not to pick up the sheaves that fell. You can read these passages. I'm just going to leave them there. Where you were not to pick up, as you were bundling the sheaves, you dropped some of the stalks, you had to leave them on the ground, and the poor of the community could come and pick them up and take them. That's what Ruth wants to do. It's not that she's asking for a job to be a gleaner and be hired as a worker. She wants to go in the field and just find someone who will show favor to her. Well, and the fact that she's saying, now watch this, she says, if I can go back to that, notice, she says, in the eyes of the one in whom I'll find favor or grace. Now she looks at this like this is going to be some kindness or generosity shown toward me. Well, actually, it was an obligation to provide like this. And so, in a sense, the poor had a right to this. But she didn't have an entitlement mentality. She still thought of it as something gracious that would be done to her. And it would seem, too, that landowners and powerful people in the community, if they were not generous, if they were not lovers of God and godly men, they could find ways to prevent people from gleaning in their fields. And so we often find in the prophets, I've listed these texts. Isaiah chapter 1 is a classic text where God rebukes them because they went through all the religious ritual, but they didn't take care. They were very fastidious and very scrupulous about observing all the ritual of the sacrifices and all of that, but they were leaving neglected. They were exploiting the needy and the widows and the orphans. And so in these texts and others, you find where it was common for Israel not to do what the law said you were supposed to do toward these people. So for her, it may end up finding someone who will show favor to her. Not just that, your laws here in Israel allow me to do this, so I'm going to go out and get it because, and I'll be home later with what we have a right to. And I like that she is looking for someone to show kindness to her. And all we find from Naomi is two words in Hebrew, just this, go, my daughter, go. And we don't know how she's feeling about this, but Ruth is showing respect to her mother-in-law and requesting her permission to go out and provide for the two of them. First, Mike had his hand up.
So is it by chance or on purpose?
Well, we're getting to that.
Okay.
We're getting to that, my friend, because that is a huge point here. Barry?
So I think the lack of entitlement goes back to God did not require the wealthy landowners to deliver the grain to the P.O. box of the poor every month.
Right.
They had to go out and do something to get that.
Right. It wasn't that people went out and brought it, like the landowners gathered it and then went door to door and brought it to those who were poor. So there's still some expectation of able-bodied people having to work, which is much different. That's what we call this entitlement mentality, the idea that, well, if I have some need, I have a right to expect the government to take care of me. That's.
And also, I didn't see any fighting amongst the poor gathering the leftovers. I didn't see any fighting in the story anyway. I don't read about it where they shunned Ruth because she's a newbie around here.
Well,
she's not from around here.
Yeah, that's interesting. We'll see the way she's treated here in a moment. That's a good point. But the law said you were supposed to do this. Ruth's looking at it like a kindness that would be shown to her. So really, is it either or? Should we help the needy because we want to or because we have to? Right. It's and a good text for that. In 2 Corinthians 9, Paul spends 2 chapters persuading the church in Corinth to do freely and willingly what they were supposed to do. What he could have just flat commanded them and demanded that they do. And in fact, he did. In 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, he said, on the first day of the week, set something aside. But then he writes at length, especially in 2 Corinthians 9, 6, and 7, we cite a lot in worship before the collection, that he's wanting them to give not out of compulsion, one translation says, but freely or willingly, for the Lord loves a cheerful giver, not someone who's giving grudgingly. What did Greg say by accident at the table? He was trying to say we're not to be stingy or grudgingly, and he combined them. He said we're not to be gringy in our giving, right? Whenever you mix up words like, say, slop dripper instead of drop slipper or whatever, if you've ever heard Andy Griffith do that routine, my wife gets tickled beyond her ability to restrain herself. So the rest of the service, after he said gringy, she was having trouble keeping her composure. All right, so it's both, right? Well, so she said, go, my daughter. Verse 3, now I need to move. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened. You remember I said that this, I think, this, I believe, is, whoops, that's not right. That's not what I meant to do. Thank you for that undo feature here. This is, I believe, one of the key passages in the book. This is tremendously important because of the hand of providence that I think the narrator is wanting us to see behind all of this. Now, let's look at the different ways that this is rendered. And that was what you were asking, right? So, and she happened. Here's it. Literally, the Hebrew could be rendered, her encounter encountered, or her chance chanced upon. Her chance came across. So how would you translate that? Literally, that's not how we speak in English. So the translators have tried to find ways to render that. The King James, the ASV, and her hap is antiquated. We don't use that word anymore. Newer translations, the New American Standard Bible, and she happened to come to, or the NIV, as it turned out, or by chance it happened to be. So it's the same expression in Ecclesiastes 2:14. The writer in Ecclesiastes, I want to make sure I don't misquote this. So let me find that, unless someone has it, wants to read it here. I wanted to pull it up without having to actually turn there. So in that text, well, all right, let me just turn there. Ecclesiastes 2:14. I'll get it. It says, that's it. I perceive, the wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet, see, the wise person is trying to walk right, and the foolish man's just reckless. But he's saying, yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. The same event. It's similar language. He says, look at verse 15. Then I said in my heart, what happens? What happens? There it is. To the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been wise? All right, we're not going to explore the idea of that, but you see this where he's saying, well, look, just whatever occurs is the idea. So what are we supposed to make of this? Well, did it just happen to be? Was it just happened to be the case? Look, in the eyes of Israel, and I've listed several passages here, and the one from Lamentations is especially good, I think, here, where it shows the attitude of Israel that they really didn't believe. You see Naomi in chapter 1. She says, everything happened to me, the Lord did it. And so they didn't have room for this idea that things just happened by chance. They believed that things were directly orchestrated by God. Look at Lamentations, that text, I'll just read that. Who has spoken, and it came to pass, unless the Lord has commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? Why should a living man complain, a man about the punishment of his sins? So he's saying, really, now this was what was called, I should have wrote this down as well, we'll get to it in a moment, retribution theology, where you thought, well, God causes everything to happen, and so if you're suffering, God caused it, and so it must be because you sinned. And that was the situation of Job's friends, and Job actually believes that himself, you see, because he doesn't understand why he's suffering, because he himself believed that you wouldn't suffer like that unless you had sinned, but he knew he hadn't sinned, so he couldn't reconcile. There was a cognitive dissonance where he couldn't reconcile his own theology with what was happening to him. But this idea that everything, good and bad, God is causing it to happen. So when you get to this, she happened, well, that's, from Ruth's perspective, she's not going and intentionally seeking out this field to find this man Boaz. That's the idea. There's no awareness on her part, as I've noted here. And I know it's a little bit hard to see in the back, but it's meant to be ironic. I think it's emphasis by understatement. It's really trying to create the exact opposite impression, and you see that especially at the beginning of verse 4. that we'll get to in just a moment. But and she happened. So, well, how is it she just happened to come to a field with a man who was in a position to be the Goel, the redeemer of Naomi's husband, who was in a position to be willing to do it and had the means to do it? How did it just happen to be? She just happened. Well, wouldn't you know it? She just happened to come to this field. Wink, wink. It's meant to be like an elbow, ironic. It's a rhetorical device here because the writer, clearly the narrator here, believes God is, when you get to the end and you see this is leading to King David, he's trying to tell you how God brought the one through whom the Redeemer of the world, the Messiah, comes into the world. And so it's meant to be ironic, and I'm going to do a whole sermon on this, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot more about it right now, and I'm going to ask you to hold your comments on it because I know we could have a lot of discussion on that. Forgive me. So when we go on in verse 4, she came to the part of the field. By the way, it's not she came to part of a field belonging to Boaz. Don't think of each one in the community having his own separate farm, but think of this giant community plot of land, and then different people were in charge of or owned different parts of it. So she came to the part of the field that everyone would work, and she happened to come, wink, wink, to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, so here's another great word. And behold, I love the way one translator put it. He rendered it this way. He's trying to find a way to convey this vav consecutive with hine, if you want to know the Hebrew there. It's he put and would you look at what happened? This is how he translates it. And wouldn't you know it? And if you want to be really colloquial, I have trouble saying that word. Looky here, and look who comes along. Well, wouldn't you know it? Boaz. See, the writer doesn't just say, and Boaz came from Bethlehem. He says, and look. That's what the word literally means. Behold, look. It's like grabbing you and turning your head and saying, look who's coming. Behold. It's a way of putting you there. Like, and look who happens to come upon. This narrator knows how to tell a story. And so, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. That's like the formula, Numbers 6, 24 and 25. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. It's the priestly blessing. But this was the common view that God is with you, and it's asking God to be present with you, and that it's the Lord who blesses. Notice how the community is centered on faith, at least Boaz and his workers here, even though this is in the time of the Judges when there's great apostasy in Israel.
The word you were talking about, behold, is that the one that also can be translated Shazam?
Shazam! Is that Gomer? Okay. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that'll work, Brother Bacon. So notice this. We'll talk about their theology in a moment, but that tells you something about them here and about their theology. Let me try this again. Yeah, I want to scrub this so I can slide this up. All right. So then Boaz said to his young man, his young man who is in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered. All right, so wow, we're really getting to something. Now let's see what the reply is here. Verse 6, she's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather from among the sheaves and the reapers. Now notice, she asks permission. Even though the law allowed the poor to walk into your field and pick up what the gleaners did not pick up. She's humble. She is polite. She's not presumptuous. Everything we find about Ruth impresses us in her interaction with the people and in the community. And here I'm trying to depict what this would be like. And just think of what hard work it was to just feed your family. You know, you couldn't go to the grocery store and buy a loaf of bread. You had to make it, and you had to go out and get what you needed to make it. And various artists have depicted it in different ways here. I really like that one because you see how they're cutting and binding up sheaves in the background, and see some of it gets dropped. And so you have these women who are coming along and picking up what was not in the bundles here. And there's the boy meets girl, where Boaz looks over and, well, who do we have here? Well, it's, again... What's that?
Was he really that old?
Well, later he says to her, when she essentially proposes to him, he says to her, bless you, child, because you didn't go after younger men. You could have gone after younger men. And so he's apparently past the age where he's an eligible bachelor that the ladies are really wanting to. Even the gold diggers weren't apparently interested. And I ain't saying she a gold digger. By the way, Kanye West is going to be in town. He's in town. I may be preaching about that tonight. You need to come tonight to talk about Kanye West. All right.
Here tonight?
He's in town. No, but we're loading up the church van to go to Joel Osteen's church to see Kanye West tonight. No. So notice he said, "Please let me glean among the sheaves and the reapers." So she came, and she was so here's what the foreman is telling Boaz. So she came, and she's continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. So she's a hard worker too. So then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter," he speaks to her tenderly. "Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one," because she could just go to somewhere else where she sees maybe more gleaning has been done and there's more stalks available. Stay here, and keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping. Go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you?" Now, what does that suggest about the time? Look down at verse 22. Notice what Naomi said. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, It's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young woman, lest in another field you be assaulted." So, look, women were vulnerable, and especially someone like her, especially a foreigner in this kind of situation. So, think of Deuteronomy 22, verses 25 through 27, that talks about if a woman is assaulted out in the field versus in the city. Where in the city, if you find a man and a woman lying together and she cries rape, don't buy it. If she claimed she was raped, she could have cried out and someone could have rescued her. But if she's out in the field and she is raped and claims she was raped, then you deal with that differently. But it does suggest that this was a problem anticipated by the law, the abuse of women who were out gleaning in the field, poor women, and the underclass are still the most vulnerable in society and easily exploited, and women especially. So notice then, Boaz said to Ruth. So look at the end of verse 9. "And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the men have drawn." Now look. He's not just told her she can glean. He told her, my men are going to watch you, and you can come and drink from. Now, he's going to do way more than this. He's going to go well beyond this. But already, Ruth is so nonplussed by his magnanimity. She's so overwhelmed by his generosity, she hardly knows what to do. She fell on her face, bowing to the ground. That's not worship in a situation like this. That is a worshipful posture, but it can also just be obeisance, like when Abraham fell before Melchizedek and such. So she falls to the ground with a reverent posture toward him and said to him, let me get to our text. She said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" So it's all the more extraordinary that everyone knows she's the girl from out of town. She's a different race. Likely, she looks different enough where you could tell by looking at her. She's not a descendant of Abraham. She's not of Semitic origin. And so she knows not only were women vulnerable, but the soldier, the person who's from another place is also, especially they're likely to be. They don't know the language. They don't know the customs. They're different. They stand out. A lot of times there's great prejudice, as we know, in our culture toward outsiders. Well, we'll finish right here. Verse 12 is so remarkable. I just want you to mark verse 12 and verse 20. So we'll try to combine chapters 2 and 3 because we have to do that to finish here. But look at verse 12, what Boaz, when he explains to her, we've heard all that you've done to Naomi. So in other words, what impressed Boaz about her is he sees the love, the loving kindness of God displayed in her. And this in turn provokes him to show a lavish generosity toward her. And notice she says, the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. He actually becomes the answer to his own prayer for her. He says, may the Lord give you refuge. And God's actually going to use Boaz to be the answer to his own prayer. It's just so beautiful. I got tears in my eyes when I was reading this chapter over the last couple of weeks, studying for it. The way he speaks to her and what's coming up here is just so powerful, so moving to see the love of God in their lives. So, and there's a great prayer I want to share with you coming up. So if you can't be in the class Wednesday, maybe go look at the class boards, or if I can get the video uploaded, watch the video. And there's just some great, beautiful, exciting things ahead. For the Lord's going to bless us in our study of this book. Thanks for your good attention this morning.